You're lying in bed next to someone. The room is quiet, and you're doing the math again. 3 years, maybe 5. All those birthdays, all those arguments you stayed through, all those times you chose to try again when every signal said stop. You add it up like you're balancing an account. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice says, after everything we've been through, I can't just leave. Not I don't want to leave. I can't. That's the trap. And most people never see it until they're already years deep inside it. This is the psychology behind why people stay in relationships that have already ended, not out of love, not out of hope, but out of something quieter and far more stubborn, the belief that the past justifies the future. Economists call it the sunk cost fallacy. Your brain calls it loyalty. And the distance between those two things is where a lot of people lose years of their life. Here's how it starts. Not with a bad relationship, with a good one. You met someone and it felt like something real. There was ease, there was excitement, there was a version of yourself you liked showing up around them. And so you invested your time, your energy, your weekends, your patience, your plans. You built something together. Maybe you moved in. Maybe you rearranged your life in small ways, then in large ones. Maybe you stopped seeing certain people because the two of you were always doing something else. None of that felt like sacrifice at the time. It felt like choosing. Then something shifted. Gradually, the way most important things shift, not in one dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of Sundays that felt a little flat, of conversations that went nowhere, of a version of yourself you stopped recognizing. You started noticing that you weren't excited to come home, that you had more energy alone, that you'd begun privately imagining a different life, then feeling guilty for imagining it. But here's what you didn't do. You didn't leave. You stayed, because look at everything you'd already put in. There's a concept in behavioral economics that describes exactly this pattern. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in something, not because the future looks promising, but because the past already cost so much. It's why people finish bad movies they paid for, why they hold on to failing stocks, why they eat food they don't want because they already ordered it. Your brain treats prior investment as an argument for future commitment, even when those two things have nothing to do with each other. Researchers studying decision-making have found this pattern remarkably consistent. The more someone has already invested, the harder it becomes to walk away, regardless of what the actual outcomes look like going forward. The investment itself becomes the logic. In relationships, this plays out in a very specific way. You stop asking, is this making me happy? You start asking, can I really give up on something I've put so much into? The question changes, and with it, so does every answer you're capable of finding. That shift from future-focused thinking to past-anchored thinking is how the trap closes around you, quietly, without announcement. It doesn't stay internal for long. The trap has external reinforcement. You two have been together so long. People say this like duration is evidence of compatibility, like time spent is the same as time well spent, and you hear it and something in you nods, because you've been saying the same thing to yourself every time you thought about leaving. You've been through so much together. This one is harder to argue with because it's true, you have. And those things were real. The hard year when someone got sick, the move, the loss, the slow rebuilding after something broke between you. None of that was nothing. But surviving difficulty together is not the same as thriving. And your brain, under the influence of sunk cost thinking, will work overtime to conflate the two. Then there are the landmarks, the upcoming vacation you already booked, the wedding you're both invited to, the lease that doesn't expire until April. Your brain uses each of these like a checkpoint. Just get through this, and then we'll reassess. And then another checkpoint appears, and then another. The reassessment never quite comes. You're just going through a rough patch. Maybe. But there's a difference between a rough patch and a rough relationship. And the part of you that's been quietly keeping score already knows which one this is. This didn't start in adulthood. The tendency to equate investment with obligation, to feel that leaving something is the same as wasting it, has much older roots. For many people, it comes from early environments where love was conditional, where staying was how you showed you cared, where leaving, even when warranted, was treated as failure, as giving up, as not trying hard enough. When you grow up learning that persistence is proof of love, you internalize something important. People who really care stay. So when you want to leave, that old voice fires. And it sounds less like economics and more like character. What kind of person quits? This is why the sunk cost trap is so much harder in relationships than in any other domain. It doesn't just feel like a financial calculation. It feels like a moral one. It feels like who you are. And so you stay, not because you're weak, not because you're foolish, but because you learned somewhere before you had words for it that leaving was the same as failing, that all those years, all that love, all that difficulty endured together, if you walk away, did it mean none of it counted? Here's what most people miss. The value of something doesn't disappear when you stop investing in it. The years were real. The love was real. Leaving doesn't erase what was. It simply acknowledges what is. There's a quieter version of this loss that rarely gets talked about. When you stay in something you've outgrown, you're not just standing still, you're actively spending. Every month in the wrong place is a month not spent building towards something that fits. Every conversation you don't have, because you already know how it ends, is energy that doesn't go somewhere it could grow. Every morning you wake up relieved to be alone for a few hours is a morning you're paying a tax you've stopped questioning. People in sunk cost relationships often describe a particular kind of exhaustion, not the exhaustion of fighting, the exhaustion of maintenance, of keeping something functional that requires constant effort just to stay in place, of being the person who manages the distance between who you two actually are and the relationship you're both performing. That performance has a cost, and it compounds. Some researchers studying relationship satisfaction have noted something worth sitting with. People who stay primarily out of constraint, out of what they've already given, out of fear of loss, out of inertia, report notably lower well-being over time than people who leave and rebuild. Not because leaving is painless, it isn't, but because the slow drain of staying somewhere that no longer fits is a different kind of pain, one that's easier to normalize because it arrives gradually, without a clear starting point. You don't notice the frog boiling. You just notice one day that you're very tired. Here's what's almost never said out loud. If you hadn't already invested all of this, if you met this person today, knowing everything you know now, would you choose them? Not do you love them? Not have you been through things together? Would you today, with clear eyes and no prior history, choose to build a life with this person? That question is uncomfortable because it removes the past as justification. It forces you to evaluate the relationship on its actual present terms. And for many people in the trap, the honest answer surfaces quickly and feels unbearable. Because here's the thing about sunk costs. They feel like reasons. They feel like evidence. They feel like proof that this must be worth it, because look at what it's already cost. But in economic terms, and in human terms, a cost that's already been paid cannot logically influence what you should do next. It's gone. The only question that actually matters is forward-facing. What does the future look like from here? Answering that question, honestly, is one of the hardest things a person can do, because it requires separating who you were from who you're becoming. It requires grieving the investment, actually mourning it, rather than using it as a reason to keep going. Leaving a sunk cost relationship isn't abandoning the past. It's refusing to let the past make decisions for your future. The years were real. The growth inside those years was real, yours, not the relationships. You are not the same person who made those early investments, and that's the detail the trap never accounts for. It calculates cost. It never calculates who you've become. People who finally leave often say the same thing months later in different words. I don't regret what we had. I regret waiting so long to admit it was over. The sunk cost trap works because it sounds like devotion. It sounds like someone who doesn't quit easily. And maybe that's true. But there's a version of not quitting that isn't loyalty. It's fear dressed in the language of commitment. It's the story you tell yourself when the honest story feels like too much to carry. You didn't stay all those years because you were weak. You stayed because you learned very early that staying was the only kind of love that counted. The question is whether you still believe that.